The engine roared like thunder as Marcus Reeves slammed his foot to the floor, his battered Ford F-150 exploding through the wrought iron gates of Sacred Heart Church. Families scattered like startled birds as 2 tons of steel and rage bore down on the marble statue that had watched over Millbrook for 60 years. But what happened in the next 10 seconds would shatter everything the town thought they knew about faith, forgiveness, and the impossible. If you're enjoying this already, smash like, subscribe, and most importantly, give this video a hype. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country down in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The afternoon sun painted Sacred Heart's courtyard in golden hues, casting long shadows from the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel for generations. Children's laughter echoed off the stone walls as families lingered after Sunday Mass, their voices mixing with the gentle splash of the fountain and the distant chimes of the bell tower. At the centre of it all stood the statue, Our Lady of Mercy, carved from Carrara marble in 1963 by an Italian master whose name had long been forgotten, but whose artistry remained immortal. Her arms stretched wide in eternal welcome, her face tilted toward heaven with an expression of such profound peace that even non-believers found themselves pausing in her presence. Maria Santos adjusted her young daughter's white confirmation dress, smiling as 8-year-old Isabella chased her older brother around the fountain. The girl's laughter was pure joy, unburdened by the weight of adult sorrows that pressed down on so many in their small Ohio town. "Mummy, can we light a candle for Abuela?" Isabella asked, tugging on her mother's hand toward the votive stand that flickered at Mary's feet. "Of course, mi amor." Maria reached into her purse for quarters, the same ritual she'd performed with her own mother decades ago. Some traditions were too sacred to break. Father Gabriel Mendoza stood on the church steps, his silver hair catching the light as he chatted with parishioners about the upcoming feast day celebration. At 72, he had shepherded this community through countless joys and tragedies, but the serenity in his weathered face suggested a man at peace with both God's mercy and his mysteries. The sound hit them like a physical blow, a deep guttural roar that seemed to rise from the very bowels of hell, growing louder and more menacing with each second. Conversations died mid-sentence. Children stopped playing. Every head turned towards the entrance gates with a growing sense of dread. The pickup truck materialized through the ornate ironwork, like a demon summoned from the darkness. Its black paint was scarred by rust and neglect, its windshield spiderwebbed with cracks, its chrome bumper dented from 100 minor collisions that spoke of a driver beyond caring about consequences. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Reeves, though few would have recognized the man he'd become. 3 years ago, he'd been the town's most respected contractor, the guy everyone called when they needed honest work at fair prices. He'd sat in the third pew every Sunday, with his wife Elena and their twin boys, his deep voice joining the hymns with the confidence of a man who believed God was in his heaven and all was right with the world. Now his eyes burned with a madness that alcohol had only sharpened, not dulled. His hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled fury, knuckles bleeding from where he'd punched his bathroom mirror that morning. The same mirror where Elena used to apply her lipstick before church, where the boys had stood on tiptoes to brush their teeth before bed. The truck's engine screamed as Marcus downshifted, picking up speed, as he aimed directly for the statue that had failed him, that had ignored his desperate prayers, that had stood silent and useless while his family burned alive in their minivan on a rain-slicked highway 3 Christmases ago. Panic erupted like a bomb detonating. "Get back! Get the children back!" Father Mendoza's voice boomed across the courtyard, his priestly calm shattered by the approaching catastrophe. Maria scooped Isabella into her arms and dove behind the fountain, concrete scraping her knees as her daughter's screams pierced the air. A teenage boy playing guitar stumbled backward, his instrument clattering to the ground as he scrambled for safety. Old Mrs. Patterson, 86 years old and arthritic, couldn't move fast enough. She clutched her rosary and closed her eyes, whispering the Hail Mary as rubber burned against stone and death approached at 40 miles per hour. The pickup truck ate the distance in seconds, its shadow falling across the statue like a harbinger of destruction. Through the cracked windshield, Marcus could see Mary's serene face growing larger, her carved eyes holding the same maddening calm they'd worn while his world collapsed around him, Every rational voice in his alcohol-soaked brain screamed at him to stop, to swerve, to spare these innocent people the violence consuming his soul. But rage had its own gravity, pulling him toward the collision that would finally make heaven pay attention to Marcus Reeves. The statue loomed in his windshield like destiny itself. 10 feet, 5 feet, 3 feet, and then the impossible happened. The truck's tires shrieked against sheet and stone as every law of physics suddenly ceased to apply. The Ford F-150, travelling at maximum acceleration with 2.5 tons of momentum, stopped as if it had struck an invisible mountain, but stopped wasn't the right word. Stopped suggested a gradual deceleration, brakes engaging, inertia transferring through the frame. This was different. This was instantaneous, complete, and utterly impossible. The engine roared at full throttle, pistons hammering, transmissions screaming in protest. The truck's frame shuddered and bucked like a wild animal straining against invisible chains. Smoke poured from the spinning rear tires, filling the courtyard with the acrid stench of burning rubber. Marcus's body slammed forward against his seatbelt, the sudden stop nearly snapping his neck. Blood filled his mouth where his teeth cut his tongue, but he barely noticed. His foot was still pressed to the floor, the accelerator pinned against the firewall, yet the truck sat motionless, barely 18 inches from Mary's outstretched hands. The silence that followed was deafening. Every parishioner in the courtyard stood frozen in a tableau of terror and disbelief. Children peeked through their fingers. Adults blinked rapidly, wondering if their eyes had betrayed them. The only sound was the truck's engine idling roughly and the distant chime of wind through the oak leaves. Isabella Santos whispered from her mother's arms, "Mammy, why didn't it crash?" Maria couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what her rational mind insisted was impossible. The truck should have obliterated the statue, should have sent marble fragments flying like shrapnel, should have killed anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. Instead, the Virgin Mary stood untouched, her white marble form gleaming in the afternoon sun. No cracks marred her surface. No chips had fallen from her carved robes. She remained exactly as she had been for 60 years, serene, eternal, indestructible. Father Mendoza felt that his legs buckle beneath him. In 5 decades of ministry, he'd seen many things that challenged easy explanation, healings that defied medical science, coincidences too perfect to be random, moments when heaven seemed to brush against earth with gossamer wings. But this was different. This was a miracle so blatant, so undeniable, that it left no room for doubt or alternate interpretation. An invisible force had intervened, had stopped 2 tons of steel with nothing more substantial than divine will. "Santa Maria, Madre de Dios," he whispered in the Spanish of his childhood, the words tumbling from his lips like water from a broken dam. The truck's driver's door creaked open, and Marcus Reeves stumbled out on unsteady legs. His face was ghost pale except for the blood trickling from his mouth. His eyes held the wide, startled look of a man who had just stared into the abyss and seen something staring back. He took 1 step toward the statue, and then another. His gaze travelled up the marble form, the flowing robes, the gentle hands, the face that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. The same face he'd cursed 1,000 times, had blamed for every unanswered prayer, every sleepless night, every bottle that promised oblivion but delivered only deeper despair. "Why?" The word escaped his lips like a dying breath. "Why now? Why not when they needed you?" As if in answer, the church bells began to toll. Not the measured peals that called the faithful to worship, but a wild, chaotic symphony that seemed to pour directly from heaven. Bronze voices crying out in languages older than words, proclaiming something that human ears could barely comprehend. Marcus dropped to his knees on the cold stone, his body racked with sobs that seemed to tear pieces from his soul. Around the courtyard, parishioners began to kneel as well, not from fear, but from recognition. They were witnessing something that would reshape their understanding of faith, of mercy, of the thin membrane between this world and the next. Maria Santos clutched her daughter closer and whispered a prayer of gratitude that would echo in her heart for the rest of her life. Father Mendoza raised his trembling hands toward heaven, his voice joining the bells in wordless praise. And at the centre of it all, the Virgin Mary stood unchanged, marble arms embracing the broken man who had tried to destroy her, stone eyes reflecting a love deeper than human comprehension. The miracle had only just begun. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days before his truck stopped inches from destruction, Marcus Reeves had been a different man entirely. He'd owned Reeves Construction, the most trusted building company in 3 counties. His crew respected him. His clients recommended him. His family adored him. On December 23rd, 3 days before Christmas, Elena had taken the twins to the mall for last-minute shopping, while Marcus finished installing crown moulding in the Hendersons' dining room. The boys, Michael and Matthew, identical in everything except the tiny mole behind Michael's left ear, had begged to stay and help their dad work. But Elena had insisted they needed new shoes for Christmas Eve Mass. "I'll be home by 6, she'd promised, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "Don't work too late, mi amor. The boys want to help you set up their new train set." Those were the last words his wife ever spoke to him. The call came at 4:47 p.m. from a state trooper whose voice carried the weight of too many similar conversations. Highway 33, just past Miller's Curve, black ice from the afternoon's freezing rain. The minivan had spun out of control, struck a semi-truck head-on. Elena and both boys were pronounced dead at the scene. Marcus had dropped his hammer and ran from the Henderson house without a word, leaving behind a half-finished job that remained unfinished to this day. He'd driven to the hospital in a haze of disbelief, certain there had been some mistake, some cosmic error that could be corrected if he just explained the situation to the right person. The bodies laid out in the morgue told a different story. Elena's face was peaceful, as if she'd simply fallen asleep while shopping. The boys looked smaller somehow, their Christmas excitement frozen in expressions that would haunt Marcus for years. He'd kissed each forehead, whispered words of love that would never be heard, and walked out of the hospital a different man than the one who'd walked in. The funeral had been a blur of casseroles, and condolences of people saying things like, "God needed them more," and "they're in a better place now." Marcus had nodded and thanked them, but inside something was breaking that would never heal properly. The breaking accelerated over the following month. Clients grew tired of Marcus showing up to job sites drunk or not showing up at all. His crew found other work with contractors who could be trusted to finish what they started. The business that had taken him 15 years to build crumbled in less than one. He'd tried prayer in the beginning, had knelt before the Virgin Mary statue every evening, begging for dreams where Elena would tell him how to keep living without her. Had pleaded for some sign that his family was safe in heaven, that their deaths meant something in God's grand design, but the marble lips remained closed. The stone eyes offered no comfort. Night after night, Marcus had poured out his heart to a statue that seemed as cold and lifeless as the graves in Millbrook Cemetery. The drinking started as a way to sleep without dreams. Then it became a way to wake up without remembering. Finally, it became a way to exist in the space between numbness and pain, never quite achieving either state completely. On this particular Sunday, the anniversary of Elena's birthday, Marcus had drained most of a bottle of bourbon while staring at family photos. The boys at last year's Little League game, Elena in her wedding dress, all of them at the church Christmas pageant, where Michael had forgotten his lines and Matthew had whispered them loud enough for everyone to hear. The rage had built slowly, like pressure in a boiler with a broken release valve. Why had God taken them? Why had the Virgin Mary, the mother who was supposed to protect all children, allowed his boys to die in terror and pain? What kind of loving deity left a man completely, utterly alone in a universe that no longer made sense? The answers to those questions sat waiting in his truck's cab, in the form of an accelerator pedal and 3,000 pounds of steel that could finally make heaven pay attention. But now, kneeling in the courtyard, with his truck's engine ticking as it cooled, Marcus realised he'd been asking the wrong questions all along. Detective Sarah Williams arrived at Sacred Heart 20 minutes after the 911 calls started flooding the dispatch centre. She'd been expecting to process a vehicular homicide scene. Drunk driver, the plows into crowd of churchgoers, multiple fatalities, standard small-town tragedy that would dominate local news for weeks. Instead, she found something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. "Walk me through it again," she said to Father Mendoza, her notebook balanced on one knee as she knelt beside the truck's front bumper. "The vehicle was travelling at what speed when it stopped?" "I'd estimate 40 to 45 miles per hour, the priest replied, his voice still shaky, from what he'd witnessed. "Detective, I've been in this courtyard for 23 years. I know the sound of brakes, the sound of impact, the sound of metal crumpling against stone. This was none of those things." Sarah examined the front of Marcus's truck with the methodical attention of someone trained to find explanations where none seemed to exist. The bumper showed no damage, no dents, no scratches, no microscopic transfers of marble dust that should have resulted from even the lightest contact. She photographed the truck from every angle, measured the distance between bumper and statue, 17 3/4 inches, collected tyre samples from the skid marks that painted a clear story of acceleration, not deceleration. "Has the truck been moved since the incident?" she asked. "No, ma'am," replied Tommy Chen, a teenage witness who'd been tuning his guitar when the chaos erupted. "It stopped right there and hasn't budged since. We were afraid to touch anything until you got here." Sarah walked a slow circle around the statue, looking for hidden mechanisms, cables, anything that might explain what the witnesses described. The marble base was solid, rooted 3 feet deep in concrete that had been poured in 1963. No recent excavation marks, no signs of tampering. She'd investigated hundreds of accident scenes in her 12-year career with the Ohio State Police. She understood momentum, mass, friction coefficients, the physics of moving objects meeting immovable ones. What she couldn't understand was how those laws had apparently been suspended for exactly the length of time necessary to prevent a catastrophe. "Detective," said Maria Santos, still holding her daughter close, "I saw the whole thing from maybe 15 feet away. That truck should have gone right through the statue and probably killed half of us standing behind it, but it stopped like it hit a brick wall. No, like the air itself turned solid. Did you see any mechanical problems with the vehicle? Anything that might have caused sudden engine failure?" "The engine never stopped running," Maria insisted. "Even after it stopped moving, the engine was still roaring. The man had his foot pressed all the way down, but the truck wouldn't budge." Sarah photographed the statue from ground level, noting the perfect condition of the marble. 60 years of Ohio weather, ice storms, hail, acid rain from industrial pollution, should have left some marks on the surface. Instead, the Virgin Mary's face seemed almost luminous in the afternoon light, as if the stone itself possessed some internal source of illumination. "Ma'am?" It was Isabella Santos tugging on Sarah's jacket with the fearless curiosity of an 8-year-old. "Are you going to arrest the Virgin Mary?" Despite everything, Sarah smiled. "Why would I arrest her, sweetheart?" "Because she stopped the truck. Daddy says when you make someone stop their car, that's against the law." Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah thought. She knelt down to Isabella's eye level. "What did you see when the truck stopped?" The lady's eyes got really bright for just a second, like when lightning flashes, but just in her eyes, and I think she smiled, but it was really quick. Isabella paused, studying Sarah's skeptical expression. "You don't believe me." "I believe you saw what you saw," Sarah replied carefully. "Sometimes our eyes play tricks on us when we're scared." "I wasn't scared," Isabella said with matter-of-fact certainty. "I knew she wouldn't let anything bad happen." Sarah spent 3 hours at the scene, interviewing witnesses, taking measurements, filling out forms that would make little sense to anyone reading them later. Every witness told essentially the same story. Truck approaching at high speed, sudden and complete stop, inches from the statue, no apparent mechanical cause. By the time she drove back to the station, Sarah had reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable when she'd woken up that morning. She was documenting something that couldn't be documented, investigating a crime that couldn't have been committed, trying to apply scientific method to an event that existed outside the realm of science. That evening, she sat in her apartment, staring at the photos she'd taken, zooming in on the statue's face from dozens of angles. The marble features remained constant in every image, serene, maternal, eternal. But in one photo, taken just as the sun broke through a cloud, the Virgin Mary's eyes seemed to catch the light in a way that made them appear almost alive. Sarah had never been particularly religious. She'd grown up Methodist, lapsed into agnosticism during college, settled into the comfortable skepticism that came with a career in law enforcement, but looking at that photograph she felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite faith, but an acknowledgement that the universe might be more mysterious than her training had prepared her to accept. She would file her report in the morning, recommending that no charges be filed against Marcus Reeves due to mechanical failure of unknown origin. It was the closest she could come to documenting a miracle in legal terminology. What she didn't know was that her investigation had captured the attention of someone with far more experience in matters that defied easy explanation. Dr. Alessandro Torretti arrived in Millbrook on a Tuesday morning, driving a rented sedan and carrying credentials that opened doors throughout the Catholic Church hierarchy. As the Vatican's chief investigator of alleged miraculous phenomena, he'd spent 27 years separating genuine divine intervention from wishful thinking, mass hysteria, and elaborate hoaxes. He'd examined weeping statues in Mexico, investigated stigmata cases in Ireland, debunked fraudulent healings in Brazil. In his experience, 97% of reported miracles had perfectly rational explanations once you dug deep enough. The Millbrook incident, however, was proving to be part of the troublesome 3%. Father Mendoza welcomed him with the nervous deference reserved for Vatican officials, though Torretti's rumpled appearance and tired eyes suggested a man more interested in truth than ceremony. "Father, I've read the police report and witness statements," Torretti said as they walked toward the courtyard. "I must tell you, the description of the events is unprecedented in my experience. Doctor, I've been a priest for 49 years. I've seen many things that challenge my understanding, but nothing like this." They stopped before the statue, and Torretti spent several minutes in silent examination. His trained eye noted details that had escaped the police investigation, microscopic variations in the marble's grain structure that formed almost imperceptible patterns, the way afternoon light seemed to linger on the Virgin's face even as shadows lengthened elsewhere. "Has there been any change in the statue since the incident? Any alterations in appearance, temperature, anything unusual?" "People say it seems brighter somehow, more present, but that could be imagination influenced by what they witnessed." Torretti removed a small device from his briefcase, an electromagnetic field detector, calibrated to identify anomalous energy patterns often associated with genuine miraculous phenomena. He'd used similar instruments at Lourdes, Fatima, and dozens of other sites where heaven had allegedly touched earth. The readings around the statue made him stop breathing for a moment. "Father, I need you to clear the courtyard. Everyone, including yourself. Is something wrong?" "I don't know yet, but these readings..." Torretti stared at the device's display, watching numbers fluctuate in patterns he'd never seen before. "Please, give me an hour alone with the statue." When the courtyard emptied, Torretti placed his hands flat against the marble base and closed his eyes. He'd developed a sensitivity over the years, an ability to sense residual spiritual energy at sites of genuine divine intervention. Most locations felt ordinary. Stone was stone, wood was wood, metal was metal, but Sacred Heart's statue hummed with something that made his fingertips tingle and his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't name. Whatever had happened here had left an imprint, a lingering presence that defied measurement but couldn't be denied. He spent the next hour taking readings from every angle, photographing the statue with specialized equipment that could detect minute variations in surface temperature and electromagnetic emissions. Every test confirmed what his instincts had told him from the moment he'd arrived. This was authentic. When Father Mendoza returned, Torretti was sitting on a bench staring at the Virgin's face with an expression of profound wonderment. "Doctor, what did you find?" "I found my faith," Torretti replied softly. "I came here expecting to debunk another false miracle. Instead, I've encountered something that will require me to completely revise my understanding of how God interacts with our world." He showed Father Mendoza the electromagnetic readings, the thermal imaging results, the photographic evidence that revealed details invisible to naked eyes. "The statue is generating its own energy field," Torretti explained. "Not electrical, not magnetic, but something else entirely. Something that registers on our instruments but exists outside our current scientific paradigms." "What does that mean?" "It means that what people witnessed here wasn't just a one-time intervention. The statue has been fundamentally changed by what occurred. It's become... I don't have adequate words. A conduit, a window, a permanent connection between our world and something beyond it." That evening, Torretti called his superior in Rome, Cardinal Francesco Bertoli, the man who'd spent 30 years investigating miraculous claims with scholarly skepticism. "Alessandro, what did you find in Ohio?" "Your Eminence, I found proof. Undeniable, measurable, scientifically verifiable proof that divine intervention can alter physical reality in ways that transcend natural law. The long silence on the other end of the connection spoke volumes. "You're certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. This event will require us to convene a full canonical investigation. And Your Eminence, you need to see this yourself. What happened in Millbrook is going to change how the Church approaches miraculous phenomena." After ending the call, Toretti returned to the courtyard for evening prayer. As darkness fell and votive candles flickered at Mary's feet, he knelt on the same stones where Marcus Reeves had collapsed in anguish and surrender. For the first time in decades, the Vatican's chief investigator of miracles found himself praying not with the clinical detachment of a scientist, but with the desperate hope of a believer who'd just glimpsed the face of mystery itself. Marcus Reeves woke up on the morning after the miracle in a jail cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair. But for the first time in 3 years, he woke up sober. Not by choice. The county lockup didn't serve bourbon with breakfast, but the absence of alcohol in his system left him vulnerable to memories he'd spent months trying to drown. Elena's laugh echoing through their kitchen, Michael and Matthew arguing over who got to sit in the front seat. Christmas morning, 3 years ago, when the boys had squealed with delight over the elaborate train set Marcus had spent weeks assembling in the garage. But alongside the painful memories came something new. The image of the Virgin Mary's face in the split second before his truck had stopped, the moment when marble features had seemed to shift from stone to flesh, from statue to living presence. "Reeves!" Deputy Morrison's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "You've got visitors." Marcus expected a lawyer, maybe Detective Williams with more questions about the previous day's events. Instead, he found himself facing Dr. Toretti and Father Mendoza in the jail's consultation room. "Mr. Reeves," Toretti began, his Italian accent softening the clinical tone, "I'm here from Rome to investigate what occurred yesterday. I need to understand what you experienced in those final moments before your truck stopped." Marcus studied the Vatican official's face, looking for judgment and finding only genuine curiosity. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." "The statue, she moved. Not physically, but..." Her expression changed. She looked at me. Really looked at me, like she could see everything I'd done, everything I'd lost, everything I'd become, and instead of condemnation, I saw... Marcus paused, struggling to find words for an experience that existed beyond language. I saw love, heartbroken love for a son who'd lost his way. Toretti leaned forward. "What else?" I heard her voice, not audibly, but in my heart. She said, "Your family is safe. Your pain serves no purpose. Let me carry your burden." Marcus's voice cracked. 3 years I've been trying to make God pay attention to my anger. Turns out he was waiting for me to pay attention to his love. Father Mendoza reached across the table and clasped Marcus's hands. "Son, do you understand what's happened to you?" "I understand that I tried to destroy something sacred, and it destroyed me instead. The old me, anyway, the man who climbed out of that truck. I don't know who he is yet, but he's not the same person who got behind the wheel. The charges were dropped that afternoon. No prosecutor wanted to be remembered as the man who sent a miracle recipient to prison. But Marcus didn't leave the jail immediately. He spent an additional night in his cell, praying in a way he hadn't since childhood, not asking for anything but simply marvelling at a God who could stop 2 tons of steel with love. When he finally walked out into the afternoon sunshine, a crowd had gathered at Sacred Heart Church. Word of the miracle had spread beyond Millbrook, drawing pilgrims from across Ohio and neighbouring states. News vans lined the street. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to share their witness account. But Marcus slipped through the crowd unnoticed, drawn not by the media circus but by the simple need to kneel once again before the Virgin who'd saved his life by saving his soul. She stood exactly as she always had, marble arms outstretched in eternal welcome. But to Marcus's transformed vision, she seemed almost to glow with inner light, as if the intervention had awakened something in the stone that had always been present but never seen. He knelt on the spot where he'd collapsed the day before and began to pray the rosary, words he hadn't spoken since Elena's funeral, mysteries he'd abandoned when mystery became too painful to contemplate. "Mr. Reeves," the voice belonged to a young reporter from the Columbus Dispatch. "Can you tell us about your experience yesterday?" Marcus looked up at the eager face, then at the crowd of pilgrims and journalists, all seeking their own encounter with the miraculous. He thought about Elena, about how she'd always said that grace was meant to be shared, not hoarded. "Yesterday, I came here to destroy something beautiful," he said simply. "Instead, something beautiful was created in me. The Virgin Mary didn't just stop my truck. She stopped my fall into hell and started my climb back toward heaven." He rose to his feet, dusted off his knees, and walked towards his truck, still parked exactly where it had stopped 17 3/4 inches from the statue. The keys were in his pocket, the engine turned over on the first try, and Marcus Reeves drove home to begin the long journey of learning how to live as a man reborn. Behind him, the Virgin Mary continued her eternal vigil, marble lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile that seemed to say, "Welcome home, my son. Welcome home." News of the Sacred Heart miracle spread quickly, splitting Millbrook into believers and skeptics. The town's only coffee shop became a battlefield. Dr. Patricia Klein insisted the event was mass hysteria, while Maria Santos swore her daughter was saved by divine intervention. Teenager Tommy Chen showed shaky phone footage of the truck's impossible stop, sparking heated debate. Even Father Mendoza and Dr. Klein, longtime allies, found themselves at odds, he urging openness to miracles, she warning against abandoning reason. Their disagreement symbolized a community suddenly fractured. The divide extended everywhere. The local paper overflowed with letters, the town council faced angry calls, and Mayor Thompson struggled to manage crowds, traffic, and sanitation as pilgrims flooded in. Businesses boomed, but infrastructure buckled. Sacred Heart's gift shop became a flashpoint. Father Mendoza resisted exploiting the event, but outsiders began selling miracle water and fake relics online. Fraud complaints multiplied, and local businessman James Morrison demanded state inspectors shut the church down for safety violations. Though inspectors found only minor issues, believers felt persecuted, staging protests that deepened tensions. Families argued at dinner tables, friendships strained, and rival groups faced off on Main Street. Candles and hymns on one side, question everything signs on the other. Watching them, Father Mendoza prayed for peace, realizing that faith and skepticism were tearing apart a town once bound by trust. It started with Mrs. Elizabeth Warren, an 83-year-old woman who'd driven from Toledo despite her family's concerns about her making the 3-hour journey alone. She'd been battling rheumatoid arthritis for 15 years, her once graceful hands now twisted into claws that made simple tasks like buttoning her coat an ordeal of pain and frustration. She arrived at Sacred Heart on a Thursday morning, moving slowly across the courtyard, with the aid of a walker, her granddaughter Jennifer hovering nervously beside her. "Grandma, maybe we should just pray from here," Jennifer suggested, as they approached the crowd gathered around the statue. "You don't need to get closer." But Elizabeth was determined. She'd driven 3 hours not for a casual prayer, but for a confrontation with whatever force had stopped Marcus Reeves's truck. If God was still in the miracle business, she intended to present her case directly. The crowd parted respectfully as the elderly woman made her painful way to the statue's base. Elizabeth gripped her walker with white knuckles, looking up at the Virgin's serene face with a mixture of hope and desperation. "I've been faithful for 83 years, she said loudly enough for nearby pilgrims to hear. "I've raised 4 children, buried a husband, watched 2 grandchildren graduate from college. I've tithed when I could barely afford groceries and volunteered when my body wanted to rest." Her voice cracked. "I'm not asking for eternal youth. I'm just asking for enough relief to hold my great-granddaughter when she's born next month." Elizabeth reached out with one gnarled hand and touched the statue's marble base. The contact sent a jolt through her arm. Not painful, but startling, like touching a low-voltage electrical fence. "Oh!" she gasped, looking at her hand in amazement. The constant ache that had been her companion for 15 years was gone. Not diminished, not manageable. Gone. She flexed her fingers experimentally. They moved smoothly, painlessly, with a range of motion she hadn't experienced in years. Elizabeth dropped her walker and stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Grandma?" Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. "Grandma, what's happening?" Elizabeth held up her hands, turning them over to examine palms and backs with wonder. "The pain," she said softly. "It's gone. All of it." She looked up at the statue with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you. Oh, thank you." Jennifer began crying as she watched her grandmother kneel without assistance for the first time in years. Other pilgrims pressed closer, some weeping at the sight, others pulling out phones to capture what they were witnessing. Word of Elizabeth Warren's healing spread through the crowd like wildfire. Within hours it had reached social media, local news outlets, and ultimately the national press. By evening, news vans were parked 3 deep on Main Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward heaven like technological prayers. But Elizabeth's healing was only the beginning. Over the following week, dozens of similar accounts emerged. Maria Rodriguez, a diabetic whose blood sugar levels had been dangerously unstable for months, found her glucose readings normalized after drinking water from the church fountain. David Kim, a veteran suffering from PTSD nightmares that had destroyed his marriage and career, slept peacefully for the first time in 8 years after praying at the statue. Not everyone who came seeking healing received it. Cancer patients remained sick. Paralyzed individuals remained in wheelchairs. The blind did not see. The deaf did not hear. The healings seemed to follow no pattern that medical science could identify or predict. Dr. Sarah Chen, an epidemiologist from Ohio State University, arrived to study the phenomenon with the clinical detachment of someone trained to separate correlation from causation. She interviewed dozens of people claiming miraculous healings, reviewing medical records, consulting with physicians, applying rigorous scientific methodology to claims that seemed to exist outside the realm of science. What I'm finding, Dr. Chen told Father Mendoza during a meeting in the parish office, is genuinely puzzling. About 30% of the people claiming healings have documented medical improvements that can't be easily explained by conventional treatment or natural recovery patterns. And the other 70%? Some show modest improvement that could be attributed to the placebo effect or natural healing processes. Others show no measurable change at all, though they insist they feel better. And a few. Dr. Chen paused, consulting her notes. A few appear to be experiencing psychological benefits that are translating into physical improvements through mechanisms we don't fully understand. Father Mendoza leaned forward. Doctor, are you saying some of these healings are real? I'm saying that something is happening here that doesn't fit our current understanding of how healing works. Whether you call it miraculous or simply unexplained, the effect is measurable and, in many cases, lasting. Dr. Chen's preliminary report would later become one of the most studied documents in the emerging field of medical anomaly research. Her conclusion that Sacred Heart was experiencing healing events of unknown etiology provided scientific cover for believers while leaving room for skeptics to maintain their doubts. But for people like Elizabeth Warren, who woke up every morning able to make coffee without pain for the first time in 15 years, the academic debates were irrelevant. Whatever was happening at Sacred Heart, it was changing lives in ways that transcended easy categorization. The healings brought new challenges. Desperate families arrived daily with sick children, terminal cancer patients, individuals suffering from rare diseases that had exhausted conventional treatments. The church became a 24-hour pilgrimage site, with people camping in the courtyard, waiting for their turn to touch the statue or drink from the fountain. Father Mendoza found himself overwhelmed not just by the logistics of managing thousands of visitors, but by the profound pastoral responsibility of ministering to people whose hopes were so high that disappointment could be devastating. "Father," asked a mother whose 8-year-old daughter was battling leukemia, "why does God heal some people and not others? Why did that old lady's arthritis get cured when my little girl is still dying?" It was the question that haunted Father Mendoza's sleepless nights, the theological puzzle that no amount of seminary training had prepared him to answer. He could offer comfort, hope, and the assurance of God's love, but he couldn't explain why grace seemed to touch some lives while passing over others. "I don't know," he told the mother honestly. "I wish I did. But I do know that God's love isn't dependent on healing. Whether your daughter is cured or not, she is precious to him, and whatever happens, you won't face it alone." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the only honest one he could give. In a place where the miraculous had become routine, Father Mendoza was learning that the greatest miracle might be finding faith that could survive unanswered prayers.